On this week's edition of New York Now, we'll cover some of the highlights from the budget framework revealed by Governor Kathy Hochul, including increasing the state's minimum wage and curbing illegal marijuana sales. We'll also bring you a story about the ongoing teacher shortage in the Empire State. I'm David Lombardo, and this is New York Now.
Today, the Senate majority will pass legislation.
I will fight like hell for you every single day, like I've always done and always will.
Passing these bills on the floor, making yet another stand for New York.
Welcome to New York Now. I'm David Lombardo, host of the Capitol Press Room, filling in for Dan Clark, who's on vacation. Earlier this week, Governor Kathy Hochul announced that a deal had been reached on the quote-unquote major decisions in state budget negotiations between her office and the Democratic majorities in the state legislature. The framework she laid out on Thursday night in the Capitol includes plans to increase the minimum wage, tweaks to the use of cash bail, and future restrictions on fossil fuel appliances in new homes. Oh, and did I mention the budget will likely include $229 billion in spending and does not include new taxes on wealthy New Yorkers? To help explain some of this developing story, we're joined at the Reporter Roundtable by Maysoon, a Capitol reporter for the Associated Press, and John Campbell, Capitol reporter for Gothamist and WNYC Radio. So, Maysoon, I want to begin by talking about the minimum wage increase that the governor teased as part of her announcement. We began this budget process with some competing proposals, both from the governor and Democrats in the legislature. What appears to be the agreed-upon plan moving forward?
So it seems like, according to the governor and what she said last night, that we're going to get minimum wage workers are going to get a wage increase of $1 in 2024. That's going to be $16, and incrementally it'll increase through the years until it hits $17. And that's in New York City. I know the rate differs in other parts of New York. So that kind of seems like the deal that has been made. I know State Senator Jessica Ramos, she's kind of pushed this other bill that would raise the wage to $21.25. And, you know, that did seem ambitious to some lawmakers, and it looks like Hochul did not take that up. But she did take up some elements of that proposal, like hiking the wage and then incremental increases and then tying it to inflation eventually. And so it seems like that's kind of the agreement that has been made on minimum wage. We'll see if there is pushback on that in coming days. But, yeah.
Well, yeah, does it seem like both sides of this debate are happy, or are progressives in the state legislature, like Senator Ramos, the head of the Labor Committee, are they happy with this deal that's been struck?
So I saw a statement from Ms. Ramos yesterday, and you know, she applauded the governor for at least raising the wages for minimum wage workers in New York, but she also again said it doesn't go far enough. And that's kind of something she has been saying since the very beginning, even seeing Hochul's executive budget proposal, just first initially just tying it to inflation. She again said that didn't go far enough, and she says the same thing now. But I'm not sure if there's enough room left to drive more change. I mean, we have been told there are conceptual agreements, so who knows if there's more leeway left, but it kind of seems like that might be the consensus.
Yeah, and that should be the caveat we have throughout this conversation. We're speaking on Friday morning, and while there's been a quote-unquote conceptual agreement, we haven't seen any bill text yet, and we don't expect to see all of the bill text for a few more days. John, do you think this will end debates at the Capitol around minimum wage increases moving forward? Because, as Maysoon said, the proposal ties future increases to cost of living changes, and theoretically, we don't need to debate the minimum wage anymore. It's done. It's off the table.
In theory, I mean, certainly it does, you know, if somebody does not want to raise the minimum wage, whether it's a governor or a House of the legislature, they can lean back on that and say, look, it's tied to the rate of inflation, and we're taking this out of the hands of the politician. But you can change that law at any time, right? And if 2 years down the road, Democratic lawmakers decide they want to push for a bigger minimum wage increase than what inflation calls for, then they'll be able to push for that. They'll be able to push for changes in future years. And you know, so the answer is no. I don't think that's the end of minimum wage as a political football in Albany.
So, John, we're speaking about 4 weeks after the state budget was actually due, and that's in part because the governor wanted to have changes to the state's use of pretrial detention and was holding out on a budget agreement until she got some of her changes. What changes, if any, did she get to the use of cash bail in New York?
Yeah, this all goes back to the 2019 cash bail reforms where, you know, judges can no longer set cash bail for most misdemeanors and nonviolent felonies. And ever since, that has been another political football in New York, particularly as the crime rate went up during the pandemic and you know, in the year after the first year of the pandemic. So this is something that the governor was pushing for. She's getting rid of what is called the least restrictive standard. This is for serious felony cases, serious misdemeanor cases where judges can set bail. There's a provision in the law that says judges still have to impose the least restrictive means necessary to get somebody back to court. They're going to get rid of that least restrictive means part, with the idea being that judges would get more discretion to set bail. It's clearer to judges that they'll be able to set bail in those cases. There was a lot of pushback in the legislature, a lot of pushback from progressives, from criminal justice reform advocates like Latrice Walker in the Assembly, who helped push for the 2019 reforms in the first place. And they're not happy with this, but the governor was insistent on it. It's the second year in a row she was insistent on making changes to the bail laws.
I've seen some reporting, though, from our colleagues that this is essentially a nothing burger change, that the practical ramifications of this is that the system that we have is largely going to be kept in place. Is it your assumption that this is going to dramatically change the use of cash bail moving forward? Did the governor, in waiting 4+ weeks to adopt a budget, get a meaningful change? Or do you think that the use of cash bail will remain similar to what we've seen in the last couple of years?
Well, there's the practical implications, but there's also the political implications. And the governor got, beat up, politically speaking, over the bail issue on the campaign trail. She narrowly defeated a Republican challenger, Lee Zeldin, in the election last year, and he made crime a major, major issue. So this allows the governor to say, look, we took those concerns seriously, and we take public safety seriously. And if she sells that to the public, maybe she can use that to her political advantage.
And the critique about the governor on all criminal justice issues has been that she's not been a good salesperson of these issues. So I imagine if we're all sitting around this table next year, we'll be talking about the changes to bail that at least Republicans were pushing. Unclear whether the governor will be looking for changes as well. And while we knew that bail was going to be part of this budget conversation all the way through, one of the things that entered the conversation late in the process was efforts to crack down on illegal marijuana sales. Maysoon, you reported a little bit on this issue leading up to the conceptual agreement and have gotten some of the details that the governor revealed in her budget announcement on Thursday. What do we know about the state's plan to try to crack down on the proliferation of illegal retail marijuana shops that have popped up all over New York since 2021?
I think it's important to note that Hochul introduced legislation maybe weeks ago, and that was kind of her proposal on how to crack down on these illicit pot shops. And so in New York right now, there's only 5 licensed pot shops in the entire state. And a lot of critics say, they've taken awfully long to, hand out licenses and get these businesses going. And the critics say that has led to these illegal, unlicensed pot shops popping up. And so if you're in places in New York City, you might see some of those. And so Hochul's proposal yesterday that she kind of unveiled was giving certain offices and state offices the enforcement tools to kind of regulate or shut down these illegal pot shops. So one of them is the Office of Cannabis Management, which has been overseeing the licensing of these, the legal pot shops. And then another is tax and finance officials. And what she said is that they're now going to have the authority to prosecute the illegal shops on tax fraud. And then that would enable them to go in, search, confiscate, and essentially shut down these shops. And so that's kind of the proposal we've heard. And if it's adopted finally, maybe next week, we'll see how it goes. But I think it'll be something important that reporters are going to keep an eye on to see how that kind of unrolls.
Well, John, it seems like a no-brainer that the state or law enforcement would crack down on businesses operating illegally. But when it comes to marijuana, the rationale for legalizing it, in part, was to reverse the negative consequences of the war on drugs and the over-prosecution of things. So has that created a bit of a tightrope that lawmakers and the governor have had to try to walk here as they try to figure out what to do about illegal marijuana sales?
Yeah, absolutely. And especially in the state assembly, there is a lot of concern anytime you're talking about increasing penalties. That is something that often draws concern, in part because, especially when you're talking about drugs, penalties have disproportionately affected people of color. So there is always a concern in that chamber in particular when you are talking about cracking down on drugs via punitive penalties. So there is concern, but I think on the other hand, though, they legalized marijuana, the state did, and there is a concern that you need a very regulated market. You need to know that the product that you're selling is safe and that it comes from a legal, regulated shop. And if they can't take enforcement action against these illegal, illicit shops, then what good is it? So there is a very, very tricky line to walk there. They seem to have an agreement on it now, but we still haven't seen the details.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this is really a big issue in New York City, where these shops have popped up all over the place. And your beat is primarily focused on New York City. So I want to turn to another New York City-centric issue, which is funding for the MTA and increasing the availability of reliable rides there. What, if anything, do we know right now about the governor's deal with the legislature to prop up the finances of this perennially cash-strapped agency, which has its own issues about providing reliable service? Anything emerge from there that the 9 million people in New York City care about?
Yeah, that's one that we have quite a bit of info on right now. And there's a bailout package, essentially. The MTA, the New York City Public Transit System, is struggling in part because ridership plummeted during the pandemic and hasn't risen to pre-pandemic levels. So there's a whole package of money going to the transit authority. The state's going to put in $365 million or so. New York City is going to be expected to put in $165 million to cover part of paratransit services. And there's also going to be an increase, nearly doubling the payroll mobility tax. It's a tax on employee salaries that the employers pay for large employers only in New York City. So this is pretty different from the basic elements are the same as what the governor proposed originally, but the numbers are very different. And suburban lawmakers, for example, were able to beat back an increase in the payroll tax in their areas as well. So, there also they're going to reduce a planned fare hike. It was supposed to be 5.5%. They're going to be able to bring that down to 4%, according to the governor's office. And there's going to be a pilot program for free bus routes, one in each borough.
And you mentioned suburban lawmakers winning on that issue, essentially ensuring that an increased tax doesn't get passed on to businesses in that area. That wasn't the only win for suburban lawmakers, though, Maysoon. They also were successful in kicking a housing proposal out that they hated, that the governor was advancing. But the governor seems like wants to revisit this in the legislature. What sort of hints did she offer about plans to revisit this in the final month now of the legislative session?
Mm-hmm. Well, Hochul said that, obviously, as you said, Republican lawmakers resisted some changes to the housing proposal.
And Democrats, though.
And some Democrats, especially with the zoning mandates and the suburbs and things like that. But Hochul said that she's interested in revisiting elements of that proposal in the legislative session after the budget's finalized, but also maybe even next year during the next budget process. And she said she wants to focus more on New York City, but she's still open to looking at the suburbs. Mm-hmm. And so there's one element in there about building housing around transit hubs. That's something that she said she'd look at. But definitely there seems like there's a focus in New York City rather than the rest of New York, as we know now.
And there's plenty of other budget news that I'm sure Dan Clark is going to get to next week when he returns. I'm looking at my notes. We can talk about charter schools. We can talk about no new taxes on the wealthy, expansion of child tax credit, school meals. But I think we would be really doing an injustice to the viewers if we didn't mention the fact that we had an A-list star at the Capitol this week. Maysoon, you had some of the best video of that. Very quickly, who did you see at the Capitol this week?
I saw Emma Stone at the Capitol this week. She was there talking about a bill on child harassment. So I was able to get her right by the Senate chamber. It seemed like she wasn't too interested in getting photographed. Gotcha. And if you take a look at the bill, it might give you some insight. But that's kind of, that was the gist of it. So.
Well, welcome to the Capitol, Maysoon.
Thank you.
A-list stars. Well, we've been speaking with Maysoon Khan. She's a Capitol reporter for the Associated Press. Mm-hmm. We've also been joined by John Campbell, Gothamist reporter at the Capitol, as well as for WNYC Public Radio. And now we're going to take a look at public education in New York, and specifically the teacher shortage in classrooms around the Empire State, which has been exacerbated by the pandemic. Despite recent efforts to replenish the ranks of educators in the K-12 system, the problem could be getting worse before it gets better, as a result of a generation of teachers expected to retire in the near future. For more on what it will take to reverse this trend, our own Catherine Rafferty has this report on what it will take to recruit and retain teachers right here in New York.
Tony Gammels, co-director of the Teacher Center of Central Westchester, noticed that teachers she worked with were stressed to the point of wanting to leave the profession.
We started talking about being a teacher and what it's like to be a teacher. And what saddened me is that the majority say they can't wait to retire. They can't wait to do something else. And they're counting the days. Even the young teachers are saying that.
Gammels believes the pandemic is a major cause of teacher stress.
Our next-gen standards are still going full blast, and we have to keep those kids up. And that is such a stress, because no teacher wants to leave their child behind. We want our students to succeed. But we have to realize they've lost time, and they've had a traumatic experience along with their teachers.
Nationwide, there are 280,000 fewer teachers in the U.S. today than before the pandemic. That's according to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. In New York, the teacher shortage was already an issue before the pandemic. Reports from the U.S. Department of Education show that enrollment in teacher education programs has declined by about 50% since 2009. Also, more than 1/3 of New York's teachers will soon be eligible for retirement. Andy Pallotta, president of New York State United Teachers, says the pandemic has just exacerbated the issue.
What the pandemic brought us was questions, a lot of questions. What's the right way to go? So we had, do we wear a mask? Do we not wear a mask? Do we have a mandate on the vaccine? Do we not have a mandate? A lot of folks were very confused by information coming out of the CDC or the state health department. So I believe that this added to a lot of the stress of those educators that were in the field already and those that were looking to go into the field of teaching. The shortage is here. We have districts right here in Albany where they still have openings from September till now. And I hear from other districts around the state that they still have openings. That never used to be the case.
Relationships between colleagues, also called collegial relationships, have been shown to help with teacher performance and retention in new studies from New York Kids, a group of researchers that aim to identify promising practices in odds-beating schools based at SUNY Albany's School of Education. Kristen Wilcox, Director of Research, and Aaron Leo, Assistant Director of Research, led the studies.
There was a lot of interest in the impacts of the pandemic on children and youth, and justifiably so, because they were very heavily impacted when schools went completely remote. Our team had some interest in issues around trauma and secondary traumatic stress.
The study had several key findings. The levels of educator collegiality were negatively impacted by the pandemic overall. But not all educators experienced the same decrease in levels of collegiality. Educators teaching remotely experienced lower levels of collegiality than their in-person peers during the pandemic. The lack of collaboration and relationships amongst educator colleagues impacted their motivation to work and for their work to benefit the students.
When teachers can work together and collaborate with each other and have that kind of collegial kind of environment, climate in the school, that really rubs off on children. It seems intuitive, but it really is a thing, and it really makes a difference on how kids actually behave with each other.
Wilcox and Leo identified positive outliers in their studies. They found a few common themes that led some school environments to stand out in this research.
The relationships between principals and other administrators and teachers was very important. Communication between administrators and teachers. So when teachers in these positive outlier schools that responded a little bit better on the survey reported less severe impacts, one of the things we found was that they felt like the school leadership communicated with them better. They kind of let them know what was going on. They solicited their input. So what's been identified as like distributed leadership, the idea that it's not just one person kind of calling the shots and everybody else has to follow in.
Looking at all the data and saying, really at the core of what we thought was a sign of resilience, and something for people to be, taking away from the pandemic is that focus on just really keeping relationships strong. The school is really a safe haven for children who are really very vulnerable, and they have more of awareness of that. And what we found in those positive outlier schools is a really kind of tuned in way of dealing with that.
One of those outlier schools was at Shaker Road Elementary in Albany County. Bill Dollard is the principal there.
In March 2020, when they made the decision, it was a Friday the 13th, and that was our last day of in-person school for that school year. We took things in 2-week chunks. I mean, that's the way we were asked to approach things. So you had a lot of noise, from the national and international news about why we were going through this, but we focused immediately on our kids and what they needed to successfully finish, their school year.
Using a distributed leadership model and implementing changes in technology helped when adapting to remote learning.
I met with grade level teams, I met with departmental teams, I met with support staff, and we just kind of checked in on each other every single day right from the jump. And we tried to share resources with each other in a way that wasn't overwhelming, was supportive, and no one-upmanship, no like, hey, try this, it's way better than what you're doing. There was none of that going on. Everybody kind of kept their eyes on the prize.
The school staff was also committed to supporting families, both inside and outside of the school, according to Dollard.
I went from, being a principal in a school and, being available to everybody in the building to now I found myself in a situation where I was hopping in my car every day and I'm driving around delivering Chromebooks or food or clothes or other things like that families needed to get through it.
Teachers creating a support system with each other was the most important factor in making it through that difficult year, according to Dollard.
It made a huge, huge impact for those people feeling like, we're all in this together. They're not doing it alone. We're on the same page and we're helping each other out.
Since 2020, the school has made strides in reconnecting with their students in person and getting them back on track in their learning.
So now in the present, the building's full. It's the highest enrollment we've had in a number of years. The kids, we see some differences for the kids who went through the shutdowns and the alternative ways of doing schooling as a result of the pandemic. They've had some longer transitions and some longer periods of learning the habits of mind about going to school. But overall, it's been very, very positive.
But teacher stress was also not unique to the pandemic. Aaron Leo from New York Kids says there are also systemic issues that contribute to burnout and the overall teacher shortage in New York.
I think teachers want to feel supported and valued, but also there are, real tangible economic issues too, like teacher salary, job security, things like that are consistently raised by, when surveyed, that's also what educators want too.
Pallotta from New York State United Teachers says it's also about respect or lack thereof for the profession of teaching.
Number one is respect the profession. It used to be something where everyone honored the teacher. We have to bring that back. There were years when it was almost like the political game to attack the schools and to say they're not doing the right thing by their students. Now, I think COVID has done something where people realize how difficult it is to be a teacher, to be able to open a young mind, to be able to make a difference in their lives, and how difficult it is. It is a tough job, and what we need to do is honor the profession first off. We in New York, we have pretty much the best pay scales in the country. So it's not just about the pay, it's about the working conditions.
But despite the challenges educators faced throughout the pandemic, those years also presented a unique opportunity to identify areas for improvement and change. Now, as we experience our first more or less normal school year since the pandemic, with students fully back in person, Tony Gamels from the Teacher Center of Central Westchester says teachers need continued support from administrators to make the recovery in learning gaps.
We look at what our students can do now rather than what they can't do. And I wish that's what administrators would do for teachers. Celebrate all the great things they do. We need to have a community of caring, and not just a community of caring in our own homes, but a community of caring within the whole school district, between our families, between administrators, between teachers. We need to care about each other because life's going on, and it's going on very fast.
And for Wilcox and Leo from New York Kids, the resilience of the teachers they surveyed is a silver lining to their research.
The pandemic has kind of highlighted how important those connections are to other people, and how we just how we stay motivated in our work, and how we develop new ideas with each other. We hope our study does that, reveals some of the things that our lessons learned of things that we could do better, better prepare our schools for the next crisis. There's likely to be one at some point, but also to celebrate, where we've been resilient, and we've come up with some really great ways of dealing with really complicated problems.
And that's all the time we have this week. But remember, you can stay up to date on all our Capitol coverage, including blog posts and past episodes at nynow.org. From all of us at WMHT, thanks for watching, and I promise Dan Clark will be back with you next week.
Funding for New York Now is provided by WNET.